The first time I saw something wrong on the road, I told myself I was just tired. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe the long, empty nights were playing tricks on me. But now I know better. I work at a toll booth in the middle of nowhere, deep in the Colorado wilderness. You wouldn't know it unless you were looking for it. There are no major signs, no rest stops, just a single isolated stretch of road cutting through the trees like a scar. And my job? I take the tolls. It seemed simple enough when I started. Night shifts, easy money, little to no interaction. The perfect gig for someone who didn't want to deal with people. But no one told me about the rules. I found them taped under the counter on my first night, written in messy, desperate handwriting, rules for the night shift. The first car will arrive at exactly 12:01 a.m. Do not take the toll before this time. Some cars won't have drivers. Don't acknowledge them. Just take the toll and let them pass. If a black sedan stops and rolls down its window, do not speak first. Let it ask the question. Answer truthfully. Never, under any circumstances, exit the booth between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. If a man in a grey uniform hands you an envelope, do not open it. Put it in the lockbox and look away until he leaves. Sometimes a woman will knock on the glass and ask for help. No matter how much she begs, do not let her in. At exactly 3:15 a.m., cover the windows with the blackout curtains. If you hear knocking, ignore it. If you hear scratching, ignore it. If you hear your own voice, turn off the lights and close your eyes. Never mention the cracks in the glass. Never touch them. Never look at them for too long. The shift ends at 6 a.m. Do not leave a second earlier, even if someone tells you to. I laughed when I first read them. I thought it was a joke, some dumb prank left behind by the last guy to scare the new employee. But then, the first car arrived, the first toll. It was exactly 12:01 a.m. when the car's headlights cut through the fog. A black SUV, sleek, spotless, rolling up to the booth like it had been summoned. The driver was a man in a suit. His face was too smooth, like his features had been airbrushed away. No wrinkles, no scars, nothing. He didn't blink. I swallowed and reached for the toll box, my fingers shaking just a little. 125, I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. The man didn't respond. He just reached into his coat, pulled out a small leather pouch, and dropped it into my hand. It was ice cold. I glanced down at it, feeling my stomach churn. The leather was moving. I wanted to throw it away, but rule number 1. I didn't take the toll early. I didn't break the rules. So I slid the pouch into the cash drawer and pushed the button to raise the barrier. The SUV rolled forward, disappearing into the night. And as it passed, I saw something in the back seat. A shape, slumped over. Not moving. I only caught a glimpse before the darkness swallowed the car whole. But I swear to God, it looked exactly like me. The knock at the window, I sat in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. It was a prank. It had to be. Just some rich guy messing with the new employee. But then, another car approached. This one was an old, rusted pickup, the kind that looked like it hadn't run in years. Its headlights flickered, engine coughing as it rolled up to the booth. The driver was an old man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. I opened my mouth to speak, but before I could, he reached into his coat and handed me an envelope. Rule number 5, do not open it. I stared at it, my hands shaking. The paper felt wrong, too soft, too damp, like skin. I shoved it into the lockbox and looked away, my pulse hammering. The old man didn't say a word. He just tipped his hat, put the truck in gear and drove off into the night. I exhaled, feeling my entire body unclench, and then the knock came. Software, right against the glass. I turned. There was a woman standing outside. She looked normal, mid-30s, brown hair pulled into a ponytail. Her eyes were wide and pleading. Her hands were pressed against the glass. "Please," she whispered, "please let me in." Rule number 6, no matter how much she begs, do not let her in. She knocked again, harder this time. "He's coming," she said, her voice shaking. "Please, you have to help me." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still. She wasn't real. She couldn't be, but she looked so human. Then her expression changed. Her lips stretched into a grin. Too wide. Way too wide. Her eyes darkened. the pupils stretching into endless pits, and she whispered in my own voice, "Let me in, Evan." I turned off the lights, I closed my eyes, and I did not move. For a long, long time, when I finally opened them again, she was gone, but the glass where she had pressed her hands, it was cracked, and the cracks were spreading. The cracks were spreading, thin, jagged lines creeping across the booth window like veins of some sick, infected thing. I tried not to stare at them. Rule number 8, never mention the cracks in the glass, never touch them, never look at them for too long, so I forced myself to turn away. The clock on the wall read 1:37 a.m., still hours to go, and I already felt like I was losing my mind. A second knock. The radio crackled. I froze. For the past hour, the station had been nothing but static. But now there was a voice, faint, muffled. "Hear me? Evan." I swallowed hard. It sounded like Roger. Roger had been the last guy to work this booth before me. I'd met him once, during training. He was a big guy, always chewing gum, always cracking jokes. But Roger had quit, walked off the job 3 weeks ago, in the middle of his shift, and no one had seen him since. I grabbed the radio, my hands slick with sweat. "Roger?" My voice came out dry, barely above a whisper. The static hissed. Then, knock, knock, knock. I whipped my head toward the window. The woman was back. Her face was pressed against the glass. Her smile was too wide, her teeth too sharp. She wasn't blinking. "Evan," she cooed. "Don't be rude. Let me in." My stomach lurched. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the counter. "She's not real. She's not real. She's not real." The radio crackled again, and this time Roger's voice was screaming, "Don't look at her. Evan, whatever you do, don't—" Then silence. I opened my eyes. She was gone. But the cracks in the glass had worsened. The shadow in the woods. I was shaking. My breath came in uneven gasps. I needed to focus. I needed to get through the shift. I checked the rule sheet again, scanning down to rule number 7. 3:15 a.m. Cover the windows, ignore the knocking, ignore the scratching. If you hear your own voice, turn off the lights and close your eyes. I glanced at the clock. 2 a.m. I just had to hold out for another hour. Another hour, and then I could block everything out. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to focus on something, anything, other than the cracks. That's when I noticed it. The shape. Standing just beyond the tree line. I leaned forward, squinting through the fog. There was a man out there, tall, motionless. His back was turned to me, arms hanging limply at his sides. The hairs on my arms stood up. What the hell was he doing out there? I reached for the intercom. "Sir?" No response. He wasn't moving. I swallowed. Maybe he was lost. A hiker. But that didn't make sense. There were no hiking trails out here, just road, forest, and emptiness. And then he twitched. His head jerked sharply like something had yanked it. I flinched. My fingers hovered over the emergency call button. He twitched again. And again. Each movement was sharp, unnatural, like he was a puppet on strings. And then, with a sickening crack, his head snapped all the way around. Facing me. My stomach dropped. His face was mine. Something is watching me. I shot up from my chair, my pulse hammering. No, that's not possible. The man in the woods was me. My exact face, my exact uniform. His mouth opened, wider than it should. And then he took a step toward the booth. I slammed my hand on the emergency call button. Nothing happened. No dial tone, no ringing. The line was dead. I spun back toward the window, and the man was gone. The woods were empty. But the moment I turned back to the booth, the radio turned on, a soft whisper. Familiar. "You're running out of time." Then click. The radio went silent, the lights flickered, and the cracks in the glass began to pulse. The cracks in the glass were breathing. They pulsed, in and out, like the window itself was alive, like something inside the glass was moving beneath the surface, trying to break free. My stomach churned. I forced myself to look away. Rule number 8, never touch the cracks. Never look at them for too long. I clenched my fists and turned my focus back to the radio. It had gone silent again, the last whisper still ringing in my ears. "You're running out of time." The clock on the wall read 2:39 a.m. 36 more minutes until I could shut the blinds. 36 more minutes until I could block out the things outside. But I had a terrible feeling. Something wasn't going to let me make it that far. The car with no driver headlights appeared in the distance. A car was approaching. I sucked in a sharp breath, trying to steady my shaking hands. I told myself this was normal. This was my job. The vehicle rolled up to the booth, a sleek black sedan. I reached for the toll button. 125, I said, voice hoarse. No response. The window was tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. I waited. Nothing happened. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Slowly, carefully, I leaned forward, just enough to get a better look inside. And that's when I realized there was no one in the driver's seat. My breath hitched. The engine was running, the headlights were on, but there was no driver. I swallowed hard. My fingers hovered over the toll drawer. Rule number 2, some cars won't have drivers. Don't acknowledge them. Just take the toll and let them pass. I forced my hand forward, reaching toward the toll slot. The moment my fingers touched the cold metal, the back door of the sedan opened. I froze. The door swung wide, yawning into the night. The inside of the car was pitch black. I couldn't see the seats. I couldn't see the floor. Just darkness. Something in the back seat shifted. I heard it move. My entire body screamed at me to look, to see what was inside. But I didn't. I grabbed the toll money from the drawer and tossed it inside. Then I slammed the button to raise the barrier. The back door swung shut. The car rolled forward, slow, deliberate, before disappearing into the fog. As soon as it was gone, I slumped back in my chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look inside. I didn't break the rules. But I could still feel it. That thing in the back seat. It had been watching me. The man in the grey uniform. The clock read 2:59 a.m. I was almost there. Just 15 more minutes, and I could shut the blinds, block everything out. I was starting to think I might actually make it. Then I saw him, a man in a grey uniform walking toward the booth. My blood turned to ice. Rule number 5. If a man in a grey uniform hands you an envelope, do not open it. Put it in the lockbox and look away until he leaves. I scrambled to sit up straight, my hands gripping the edge of the counter. He stopped just outside the booth. His uniform was clean, pressed, completely blank. No name tag, no patches, just grey. His face was pale, his skin stretched too tight over his skull, and his eyes were solid black, no whites, no pupils, just endless, empty black. I swallowed hard. My tongue felt like sandpaper. The man slowly raised one hand, thin, skeletal fingers wrapped around a yellowed envelope. He didn't say a word, he just held it out. Waiting. I reached forward, hand trembling. The paper was damp. Software. I shoved it into the lockbox without looking at it. My fingers fumbled to turn the key, locking it shut. And then, I looked away. I kept my eyes on the clock, my breath coming in shallow bursts. 5 seconds. 10. 15. Silence. I swallowed hard. My skin crawled with the sensation of being watched. But I didn't look. I didn't look. And finally, the footsteps faded. He was gone. 3:15 a.m. I lunged for the blackout curtains. The moment the clock hit 3:15, I grabbed the thick fabric and yanked them shut, blocking out the windows. I was not taking any chances. Darkness swallowed the booth. I sat in my chair, hands clenching my knees, heart hammering. Then the knocking started. Soft at first, tap, 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 then harder. Knock, knock, knock. I clenched my jaw, ignore it. The knocking turned to scratching, fingernails against the glass. Slow, deliberate. I squeezed my eyes shut. Ignore it. Then I heard my own voice. Evan. The blood in my veins turned to ice. Evan, open the door. Number no, no, no. Evan, please, something's out here. I need help. I clenched my teeth so hard they ached. It wasn't me. I knew that. But it sounded like me. It was perfect. Evan, don't do this. I bit down on my tongue. The voice changed. No longer pleading, no longer scared, just cold. If you don't open the door, I'll break the glass. My stomach dropped. The cracks in the window groaned, spreading, splintering. Something pushed against them. And then a single jagged piece of glass fell to the floor. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The silence stretched on. Then, finally, the voice whispered, "Soon." And everything went still. The silence felt unnatural, like the world outside the booth had been swallowed whole. I forced myself to breathe. In, outside, slow, controlled. The jagged shard of glass lay on the floor at my feet, a single razor-edged wound in the booth's fragile armor. I should have picked it up. I should have thrown it away. But I didn't. Because the moment I reached for it, I swore I saw something move inside it. A reflection that wasn't mine. The call that shouldn't have been possible. I sat frozen in the chair, heart hammering against my ribs. The rules had never mentioned this. The cracks had gotten worse before, but they had never broken. A piece had never fallen. I clenched my fists, forcing my mind to stay focused. I still had time before the next rule kicked in. 4:44 a.m. Stay perfectly still. If anything moves outside, do not react. Do not blink. Do not breathe too loud. The clock read 3:42 a.m. I needed to pull myself together. That's when the phone rang. I nearly jumped out of my skin. The toll booth had a landline, but in the 2 weeks I'd worked here, it had never rung once. The number on the display was blank. Don't answer it. That's what my gut told me. That's what every instinct in my body screamed. The silent screams, the channel of interesting horror stories. If you are new on this channel, then don't forget to subscribe The Silent Screams and press the bell icon for interesting stories. Before we move on, please donate me in the form of subscribe. But I reached for it anyway. Maybe it was someone real, maybe it was help. I lifted the receiver to my ear, silence, then a single ragged breath. "Evan," a voice whispered. My blood turned to ice. I knew that voice. I had heard it screaming over the radio. Roger. The guy who worked here before me, the guy who had walked off the job and vanished. I swallowed, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. Roger? Silence. Then, they let me call this time. I felt something cold drip down my spine. Let him? My throat was dry. Roger, where are you? The static on the line hissed. Then, in a voice so low I could barely hear him, "Evan, listen. The rules don't always work." The bottom of my stomach dropped. What? They changed them. His voice was shaking. Every shift, The phone went dead. I stared at the receiver, my pulse roaring in my ears. And then, slowly, the dial tone started again. But something was wrong. It wasn't the normal, steady hum. It was a voice, a low, distorted murmur. At first, I couldn't make out the words. Then, knocking, knock, knock. A chill crawled up my spine, and before I could react, the knocking started again. The woman without a face knock, knock, knock. I sucked in a breath, every muscle in my body going rigid. I had shut the blackout curtains. I couldn't see who was outside, and I wasn't supposed to look. But my curiosity was a sickness. Slowly, painfully, I reached for the edge of the curtain, just a sliver, just enough to peek. My fingers trembled as I pulled the fabric back, just an inch. And then I saw her, the woman from before, standing just inches from the glass. Her hands were pressed against the window, fingers splayed unnaturally wide, but her face was gone. Not covered, not blurred, just missing. A smooth, featureless void where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. My stomach twisted. I yanked the curtain shut so hard the rod rattled. I didn't look again. I stayed perfectly still, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The knocking didn't stop. I clenched my hands into fists. She couldn't get in. She wouldn't break the glass. Would she? The reflection in the glass. The minutes crawled. I kept my eyes locked on the clock. 3:57 a.m. The knocking had stopped. The booth was silent. But something felt wrong. I could feel eyes on me. Slowly I turned to the window again. Not at the glass, but at the floor. The fallen shard was still there, and this time I knew I wasn't imagining it. Something was moving inside, a reflection, a face, and it wasn't mine. It was grinning. My breath hitched. I shot out of my chair, my body screaming at me to destroy it. But I didn't touch it. I couldn't. Because as I stood there, frozen, the reflection inside the shard moved on its own. It lifted a hand. It placed a finger to its lips. And it shushed me. I stumbled back, knocking over my chair. The reflection's grin widened. And then it whispered, not aloud. Not in my ears, inside my head. Software. Playful. Almost time. The lights in the booth flickered. The walls creaked. And behind me, the clock struck 4:44 a.m. The moment the clock struck 4:44 a.m., the world outside the booth shifted. Not in a way I could see, at least not at first. But I felt it. Like the ground had dropped an inch, like the air had become heavier, thicker, like something had stepped through. I held my breath, fists clenched at my sides. Rule number 9, if anything moves outside at 4:44 a.m., do not react, do not blink. Do not breathe too loud. Something was out there. I didn't see it. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Standing just beyond the booth, outside my line of sight, waiting, testing. I forced my muscles to stay still. Don't move. Don't look. The lights in the booth flickered. The air was thick with something rotten, something that smelled like wet earth and decayed leaves. Then a shadow passed across the glass. I bit my tongue. It wasn't walking. It was gliding. Something huge, something with too many limbs. The temperature in the booth plunged, my skin prickled with goosebumps, my breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts. The shadow circled the booth, slow, deliberate, testing the edges of my control. It stopped right outside the window. My peripheral vision caught a shape. A body, number bodies. Melted together, twisted into something that barely resembled human. Fingers, long, grasping fingers, brushed against the glass. I stayed still, didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even let my breath fog the glass. The shadows rippled, and then it bent down. It looked at me. I saw the shape of its head, its twisted, melted faces. It was looking at me. It knew I was here. The seconds stretched into eternity. I could feel something crawling beneath my skin, something pressing against my skull, whispering, "Look at me. Look at me. Look at me." I bit down harder on my tongue. Blood filled my mouth. I didn't look. I didn't move. And finally, the shadow slithered away. The air shifted. The weight lifted. And just like that, the clock read 4:45 a.m. I sucked in a sharp breath, my lungs burning. I had made it. Barely. A box with no name. The moment I could move again, I lunged for the rules list. My fingers shook as I ran my eyes over every word, looking for changes. Roger's voice rang in my head. The rules don't always work. They change them. Nothing looked different, but I knew better than to trust that. I had almost slipped up twice tonight, the cracks in the glass, the knocking woman. I had to be careful. I had to pay attention. A thud outside made me jump. I turned, heart hammering, and saw it. A wooden box, sitting just outside the booth, dead center on the pavement. Rough, splintered wood. No markings, no labels, just a box. My mouth went dry. The rules didn't say anything about this, and yet I knew. It was meant for me. What's inside? I stared at the box for what felt like hours. My pulse pounded in my ears. My fingers twitched. Do not open it. Every fiber of my being screamed that at me. Do not touch it. I had made it this far by following the rules, by obeying. But Roger's words whispered in my head again. The rules don't always work. I licked my lips. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the drawer beneath the counter, pulled it open. Inside was a flashlight, a small knife, and an old lockbox. I grabbed the lockbox. If the man in grey could leave envelopes, then maybe, just maybe, this was meant to go inside. I took a deep breath. Then, before I could talk myself out of it, I threw open the booth door, grabbed the box, and shoved it inside the lockbox. The second I did, a sound split the night, a low, rumbling growl. The ground shook. The lights in the booth blew out. The air turned heavy, thick with the scent of burning wood and rotting flesh. And then, from just beyond the trees, something screamed. 5 a.m., the siren that shouldn't exist. A wailing, distorted siren erupted through the trees, deep, mechanical, but wrong, like something alive was screaming beneath the sound. The ground shook again. The trees at the edge of the highway bent. Something was coming. I clutched the lockbox to my chest. Whatever was inside this thing, I wasn't supposed to have it. I turned back to the booth, heart pounding. And that's when I saw the new rule. A fresh line had been burned into the paper right at the bottom of the list. It hadn't been there before. It was still smoking. The letters blackened, charred, and my stomach dropped as I read it. Rule number 13. If you take something that isn't yours, return it before sunrise, or something will come for you. I looked down at the lockbox in my hands. My breath came in quick, panicked gasps. I had broken the rules. I had stolen something. And now, something was coming to take it back. The siren wailed. The sound rattled through my skull, a deep, hollow vibration that didn't feel right. It was wrong. Too organic. Like something was screaming beneath it. I gripped the lockbox tighter, my fingers slick with sweat. The new rule burned in my mind. If you take something that isn't yours, return it before sunrise. I didn't know what was inside the wooden box I had shoved inside the lockbox, but whatever it was, I wasn't supposed to have it. And something was coming to take it back. Outside, the trees bent. The siren wavered, distorted, like it was being dragged across the sky. A shadow rippled in the distance, shifting between the trees. And then, I saw it. Tall, too tall, a silhouette against the fog. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too thin. And at the top of that shifting, twisting form, a head with no face, just a gaping hole where a mouth should be. The siren wasn't coming from a speaker, it was coming from inside it. A deep, agonized howl that split the night. My stomach twisted, my head throbbed, every instinct in my body screamed to run. But I couldn't. I was trapped in a glass box. And it was coming for me. A deal with the unknown. I whipped around and stared at the new rule on the paper. Return it before sunrise. But how? I didn't even know where the box had come from. I forced myself to think, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The man in grey. He was the one who left the envelopes. He was the one who brought things to the booth. Maybe, just maybe, this box belonged to him. I fumbled with the lockbox, my fingers trembling as I pulled it open. The wooden box sat inside, splintered and worn. I had to put it back. I had to give it back. I didn't know what would happen if I waited until sunrise, and I didn't want to find out. I turned back to the window. The thing in the trees had moved closer. Much closer. It stood just beyond the pavement, its twisted limbs twitching. The siren lowered into a deep guttural growl. It was watching me, waiting. I don't have time. I grabbed the wooden box, took a deep breath, and threw open the booth door. A step into the fog. The cold hit me like a slap. Thick, wet fog coiled around my legs, clinging to my skin like something alive. I forced myself forward, every muscle screaming at me to turn back. The thing in the trees didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, its invisible, empty gaze. My fingers dug into the wooden box. I turned in a slow circle, searching the dark highway. The man in grey wasn't here. There was no one here. Just me. And it. My breath came in short gasps. I was running out of time. I had to put the box back. But where? I turned back toward the booth and froze. The glass was covered in writing, scrawled in black ink, words smeared like they had been written in a hurry. Leave it on the road. Do not open it. My stomach twisted. I turned back to the highway, my fingers trembling. I took one shaky step forward and set the box on the pavement. The siren rumbled. The ground shook. I took a step back. And another. The box sat in the middle of the road, untouched, unmoving. And then, the fog rushed in. Like a living thing, it coiled over the asphalt, swallowing the box whole. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and just like that, the siren stopped. The air shifted. The world exhaled. The trees stood still again. I turned. The thing was gone. A warning from the dead. I didn't go back inside the booth right away. I stood on the pavement, sucking in lungfuls of freezing air, my body still shaking. The lockbox felt lighter. Whatever had been inside it was gone. The new rule on the list was fading. The ink vanished, leaving only the old familiar rules behind, like it had never been there at all. I let out a shuddering breath. I had done it. I had followed the rule, I had survived. For now. But before I could take a step back inside, the phone rang. A sharp, shrill sound that cut through the silence like a knife. I turned, my stomach twisting. The phone inside the booth was ringing. For the second time tonight, for the second time ever. I took a slow step forward, then another. I pushed open the booth door, reached for the receiver, and lifted it to my ear. Silence. Then, a whisper. "You're not safe, Evan." A shiver crawled down my spine. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. The rules won't always protect you. A burst of static. Then the line went dead. I stood there, gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white, and slowly, painfully, I set it down. The booth was silent. The rules list sat on the counter. The fog had thinned. The shift was almost over, but deep down I knew something had changed tonight, and I wasn't sure if I would ever be safe again. The phone call left me rattled. I sat inside the booth, gripping the counter, staring at the rules list like it would somehow explain everything. But it didn't. The list was the same. No extra rules, no new warnings. And yet, the words whispered over the phone clung to me. "You're not safe, Evan." I swallowed hard, glancing at the clock. 5:21 a.m. Less than an hour before sunrise, less than an hour until I could go home, if I even had a home to go back to. I rubbed my face, exhaling sharply. Keep it together. I had made it this far, I just had to hold on a little longer. Then, headlights. A car was coming. I straightened, forcing my spine rigid, forcing my mind into work mode. The vehicle rolled closer, engine purring too smoothly. I squinted through the windshield, and my stomach turned. It wasn't real. The car was immaculate. Not a single scratch, not a speck of dust on the sleek black exterior. The tires didn't leave marks on the pavement. The headlights were too bright, too white, like they weren't coming from halogen bulbs, but from something else. The car glided to a stop in front of the booth. The driver's window rolled down, and inside sat a man. A man in a perfectly pressed black suit, with a perfectly blank face, no eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. Do not acknowledge it. Every instinct screamed at me to slam the window shut, to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen. I forced my eyes down to the counter, gripping the edges so hard my knuckles ached. I knew this rule. Rule number 11. If a car arrives with a driver who has no face, do not acknowledge it. Do not look at it. Do not speak. It will leave when it realizes you will not engage. I stayed still. The air felt thick, like the world had stopped breathing. I could feel it watching me. Even without eyes, I could feel its gaze. The window was still open. The engine still hummed. It was waiting. I didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe too loud. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a whisper, so soft I almost didn't hear it. "Evan." My stomach dropped. It knew my name. I bit the inside of my cheek, forced myself not to react, not to move. Another whisper. "We need to talk." No, we didn't. We absolutely did not. Silence again. The car idled. A minute passed, then another. And finally, the engine revved, the window rolled up, and just like that, the car pulled away, gliding off into the fog, vanishing into nothing. The air lightened. The tension snapped. I exhaled sharply, my whole body shaking. What the hell was that? I had followed the rule. I hadn't looked at it. I hadn't spoken. And yet, it had spoken to me. It had known my name. What's changing? I leaned against the counter, running a shaky hand through my hair. First, the wooden box. Then, the new rule that burned itself into the list. Now, the faceless driver breaking the rule by speaking. Something was changing. The rules weren't fixed. They weren't safe. And now, something wanted me to know that. I turned, glancing at the clock. 5:45 a.m. 15 minutes. 15 minutes, and I could get out of here. I just had to make it to sunrise. The man in grey returns. I stared at the empty highway, waiting for the next horror to show up. But nothing came. Just silence, the occasional rustling of the wind through the trees. Then, a shadow, not one of theirs, not something wrong, but something familiar. My chest tightened as I watched a tall, thin figure step out of the fog. A crisp grey suit, a pale, gaunt face, and in one gloved hand, an envelope. The man in grey. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay calm. He walked up to the booth, his expression unreadable, and he slid the envelope onto the counter. I hesitated, but eventually I reached forward and picked it up. The envelope was heavier than usual, and this time it had my name on it, scrawled in black ink. I looked up, but the man in grey was already gone. A letter I never wanted. My pulse pounded as I turned the envelope over, fingers shaking as I pulled it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it, breath catching in my throat, and I read the words. 3 simple sentences, written in the same precise black ink. Evan, the game has started. You won't be able to leave. My blood ran cold. I stared at the letter, heart hammering, my hands going numb. What the hell did that mean? I turned, eyes darting toward the clock. 5:58 a.m. Sunrise was in 2 minutes. I should have felt relief. I should have been getting ready to leave. But deep down, I knew. I wasn't going anywhere, not anymore, because this wasn't just a job. It never had been. This was a trap, and I had just been claimed. The letter felt heavy in my hands. The game has started. You won't be able to leave. The words stared back at me, twisting my stomach into knots. I turned my gaze toward the clock. 5:59 a.m. 1 more minute. 1 more minute and the sun would rise. I would step out of this booth, get in my car, and drive away. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. But something in my gut told me that wouldn't happen this time. That the rules had changed. I gripped the counter, forcing myself to breathe. Then, the world flickered. A glitch in reality. For a split second, everything. The road, the trees, the sky, the booth. It all glitched, like a bad signal on a television screen. A hiccup in reality itself. And then, darkness. The overhead lights in the booth flickered and died. The glow of the approaching sunrise vanished. I was suddenly engulfed in a thick, suffocating blackness, like the world had been swallowed whole. I couldn't see the road. I couldn't see the trees. The only thing still illuminated was the clock, 6 a.m., and yet the sun did not rise. I am stuck here. My breath came fast and sharp, my pulse hammering in my ears. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight, but the screen was dead, no power. I grabbed the radio next, tried calling into dispatch, static, loud, grating static. Like someone was pressing the button but not speaking. I slammed the radio down, swallowing a rising wave of panic. I should have been leaving. The sun should have been up. The shift should have ended. Instead, I was trapped. The letter had warned me, and now I was living it. Something is coming. I leaned against the booth's cold metal wall, trying to think, trying to breathe. Then, a sound. Distant at first, soft, rhythmic, like footsteps, coming closer. I squinted into the darkness, but there was nothing. No headlights, no movement. Just the sound of footsteps on pavement, getting louder, closer. I held my breath. Then, bang! A single hard knock against the glass of the booth. I jumped, heart slamming against my ribs. A shape stood outside, tall, wrong, a silhouette against the empty blackness. It shouldn't have been there. Nothing should have been there. A new rule. I scrambled for the rules list, frantically searching for anything that could tell me what to do. But the list was changing. The ink. It bled across the page, twisting, warping. New words formed. A rule I had never seen before. Rule number 14. If the sun does not rise, do not leave the booth. Do not open the door. Do not speak. Do not react. It will test you. Do not fail. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay still. The shape outside didn't move. It just stood there, waiting, watching. Then, bang! Another hard knock. This time it came from the other side of the booth. I jerked, my head snapping. But there was nothing. Bang! Behind me now, bang, bang, bang. The knocks came from all directions, surrounding me, pressing in. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. The list had said not to react. I had to follow the rule. I had to ignore it. It knows my weakness. The knocking stopped. Silence swallowed the booth once more. I opened my eyes, and my blood froze. Through the glass I saw something new. Not a shadow, not a faceless figure, but a person. A person I knew. My sister. She stood just outside the booth, her eyes wide, filled with fear, her clothes torn, her face pale. She shouldn't be here. She lived miles away, hundreds of miles away, and yet, there she was, looking at me. Her lips moved, but there was no sound. Then her eyes filled with tears. Her expression was desperate. She needed me. She was begging me. I clenched my fists, my entire body trembling. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. This was a test, just like the rule had warned. But my heart, it ached. My sister had always been the only family I had left, and now she stood outside the booth pleading for my help. Was it really her, or was it something else, something using her face? I swallowed the lump in my throat. I had to follow the rule. I had to ignore it. But then, she spoke. Her voice cut through the silence, trembling, broken. "Evan, please." I squeezed my eyes shut. I couldn't look. I couldn't listen. Then, something changed. The air turned thick. The booth felt smaller, like the walls were closing in. Then, a whisper, not from outside, but from inside, right next to my ear. "You already lost." I gasped, and the light snapped back on. The sun was rising, and outside the booth, there was no one there. The first thing I noticed was the silence, thick, heavy, suffocating, like the world itself was holding its breath. Then, the sun rose. A wave of golden light poured over the road, stretching across the trees, chasing away the shadows. I let out a shaky breath. It was over. I had followed the rule. I hadn't opened the booth. I hadn't spoken. And yet, something still felt wrong. The sun is off. I glanced at the clock. 6:01 a.m. The shift was over. I should have been relieved. I should have been safe. But the sun, it wasn't right. It looked wrong. Too bright. Too big. The color of it, not the soft gold of morning light, but a deep burning orange. Like fire. Like something was watching. I swallowed hard, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after everything that had happened. I stepped out of the booth, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was still. Too still. No wind, no birds, no distant sound of traffic. I pulled out my car keys, forcing my hands to stay steady. Just get in the car. Drive away. Forget. Forget what I saw. Forget what I heard. Forget the whisper that had crept into my ear. You already lost. The road home is different. I slid into my car, turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I exhaled, gripping the steering wheel. Then, I looked at the road, and my stomach dropped. It wasn't the same road. The pavement stretched forward, winding through the forest. But it wasn't the road I had driven in on. The lines were missing. No yellow divider, no white shoulder markings, just an endless stretch of blacktop disappearing into the trees. I gritted my teeth, shaking my head. No, this was just my mind messing with me. I had been awake all night. I had seen things I shouldn't have. I just needed to drive. Once I hit the highway, everything would be fine. I pressed my foot on the gas. The car rumbled forward, and I left the booth behind. The forest is watching. The trees on either side of the road were wrong. Too tall, too close together, their branches twisted toward the sky like skeletal fingers. I tightened my grip on the wheel, keeping my eyes straight ahead. Just drive. But the deeper I went, the darker it became. Despite the sun being out, the forest seemed to swallow the light. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the road. I turned on my headlights. They barely cut through the gloom. Then, out of the corner of my eye, movement, something darting between the trees. Tall, thin, watching. I forced myself to keep driving. Faster now, the road stretched on endlessly. Too long, too far. I should have reached the highway by now, and yet the forest never ended. Something is in the car. Then I heard it. A sound from the back seat, software barely there, breathing. I went still. A cold wave of fear washing over me. I didn't turn around. I didn't look. I kept my eyes on the road. The rules from the booth echoed in my head. Do not acknowledge it. Whatever was back there, it wasn't human. It wasn't real. It was testing me, waiting for me to break. My pulse hammered in my ears. The breathing grew louder, closer, like it was leaning forward. I could feel it now, just behind my seat, watching me. I gritted my teeth. Ignore it. Then, a whisper. You're going the wrong way. A shiver crawled up my spine. The voice was familiar, my sister's voice. I clenched my jaw, pressing harder on the gas. Faster, faster. The trees blurred past, the road stretching forward endlessly. You have to turn around, Evan. Number this wasn't real. She wasn't real. I swallowed, forcing my breathing to stay steady. I wouldn't fall for it. I wouldn't break. Then, something cold touched my shoulder. Fingers, thin, icy, too long. I almost screamed. Almost. But I didn't. I kept driving, kept my eyes straight ahead. And then, the forest ended. Back to reality. Or not. Suddenly, I was on the highway. The sun was normal, the trees were gone, and my rearview mirror was empty. No one in the back seat, no one there at all. I gasped for breath, my entire body shaking. Had I imagined it? Had I just driven through some kind of nightmare? I didn't know. I didn't want to know. I just wanted to get home. But as I pulled into my driveway, something made my blood turn to ice. My phone. It was back on. A new notification blinked on the screen. A missed call, from my sister, and a voicemail. I swallowed hard, pressing play. Her voice crackled through the speaker, software, frantic. Evan, where are you? I've been trying to call you all night. Something's wrong. I had a dream. A pause. Then her voice dropped to a whisper. Evan, whatever you do not go back to the booth. The message ended, and deep in my chest, I knew. I had to go back, because whatever was happening, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Even though I was home, even though the sun was shining like any other normal morning, I felt like I had never really left the booth. My sister's voicemail kept playing in my head, over and over again. Do not go back to the booth. But I knew I had to. Because if I didn't, something else would. Signs of the wrong world. The first thing I noticed was how quiet my house was. Not just the normal kind of morning quiet, but too quiet. No cars outside, no wind. No distant sounds of life, like the world itself was watching. Waiting. I stood by my bedroom window gripping my phone in one hand. Something felt wrong. The sky outside was clear, bright blue, but something about the shade of it was off. Too deep, too sharp. Like an imitation of the real thing. Then, a sound, from the hallway, software, familiar, footsteps. I turned, heart pounding. My sister, number she didn't live with me. She hadn't been here in years. But I heard her voice. Evan? Low, distant, echoing, like it was coming from the wrong place. I stepped back, gripping my phone tighter. It wasn't her. It couldn't be her. I took a slow, careful breath, then I checked my phone again. No new messages, but the voicemail, the one she left me before, it was gone. Deleted. Erased like it had never existed. That was when I knew. I had already waited too long. I had to go back. The toll booth awaits. The drive back to the toll booth was uneventful. No strange roads, no missing highway lines, no unnatural silence. But the unease in my chest didn't fade. If anything, it grew. The closer I got, the more it felt like the air itself was pressing down on me. The booth appeared in the distance, small and unassuming, just like it always had been. But the moment I pulled into the lot, I knew something was off. The lights inside were already on. The door was open, and someone was sitting in my chair. A familiar stranger. I killed the engine and sat there, gripping the wheel. The person inside the booth wasn't moving. They just sat there, staring out at the road. At first I thought it was my boss, or maybe another worker I hadn't met yet. But as I stepped out of the car and got a closer look, my stomach dropped. It was me. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't just someone who looked like me, it was an exact copy. Same clothes, same posture, same blank, exhausted stare, a perfect imitation. It hadn't seen me yet. Or if it had, it wasn't acknowledging me. I took a slow step forward, heart hammering against my ribs. The air around the booth felt wrong, thick, heavy, like walking through water. Then, as if sensing my presence, the copy of me slowly turned its head and smiled. "You're late." The words came out in my own voice, flat, emotionless. My skin crawled. The thing inside the booth leaned forward, placing both hands on the counter. Its fingers were too long. Just slightly. Not enough for a normal person to notice. But I did. It cocked its head, waiting, expecting me to say something. But I knew better. The rules. I followed the rules. I didn't speak. I didn't acknowledge it. Instead, I took another step back, ready to get into my car and get the hell out of there. Then, the thing's smile widened. Slow, stretched, too many teeth. "You're not supposed to be here." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just speaking in my voice anymore, it was mimicking my exact tone, my exact inflection. Like it had been studying me. I turned, reaching for my car door. Then, it moved, faster than anything should be able to move. 1 second it was inside the booth, the next it was right behind me, close enough that I could feel its breath on my neck. Cold. Wrong. "Go home," it whispered. "Forget. Leave before it's too late." I clenched my jaw, my entire body trembling. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just kept my eyes on the car. Then, it laughed, software, mocking, like it knew a secret I didn't. "You never left," it murmured. The words sent a bolt of ice through my veins. I never left. What did that mean? Hadn't I driven away? Hadn't I gone home? Hadn't I? Something cold touched my wrist, and suddenly the world shifted. The parking lot was gone. The road was gone. The trees were gone. I was inside the booth, sitting in the chair, my hands resting on the counter. Like I had been there all along, the door was closed, the lights were on. And outside, the sun was setting. Deep orange, burning. Like fire, like something was watching. And in my lap, a new set of rules, scrawled in my own handwriting. "Welcome back, Evan. Rule number 1, do not trust the things that wear your face." I stared at the piece of paper in my lap. My own handwriting, a new set of rules. The letters were shaky, uneven, like I had written them in a hurry, or in fear. Rule number 1, do not trust the things that wear your face. I swallowed hard, my pulse thundering in my ears. I hadn't written this, at least I didn't remember writing it. But as I read the next rule, a sick feeling settled in my gut. Rule number 2, if the booth door is open when you arrive, do not enter. Wait outside until it closes. I glanced at the door, still shut, still locked. But I remembered what had happened before. The door had been open, and inside had been me. Or something pretending to be me. My hands shook as I gripped the edges of the paper, forcing my eyes to move down. Rule number 3, the sun is not your friend. If it sets too quickly, do not look at it. Do not acknowledge it. Keep your head down and wait. I swallowed. The sun was still low in the sky, glowing deep orange. But had it always been this low? I forced myself to keep reading. Rule number 4, there will be knocks on the window. Some will be from people, some will not. Choose carefully. My stomach twisted. I didn't want to read anymore, but my eyes had already moved to the last one. Rule number 5, if someone calls your name from outside, do not answer, even if it sounds familiar. My breath hitched, because almost as soon as I finished reading, something knocked on the glass. The knock at the window. Soft, rhythmic. 3 slow taps. I clenched my jaw, my hands gripping the arms of my chair. Another knock, louder this time. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then a voice. Evan. Familiar, feminine. My sister. I nearly turned around instinctively, but I stopped myself, just in time. The rules. Rule number 5, if someone calls your name from outside, do not answer. I stared straight ahead. The road was empty, darkness creeping in at the edges of the horizon. I swallowed hard, Behind me, the voice spoke again. Evan, please. It was her voice, but it was wrong, too hollow, too perfect, like a recording being played through a broken speaker. I shut my eyes, fought the urge to turn around. Then, the knocking stopped. Silence, thick, heavy, like the whole world was holding its breath. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You never left." My stomach dropped. A chill ran down my spine. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still. Then, a slow, deliberate sound, a scraping against the glass, like fingernails, dragging, peeling, trying to get inside. I kept my eyes forward, refused to look. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, silence. I forced myself to take a slow, shaky breath. The weight of the moment pressed down on me. Was it gone? Had I followed the rules correctly? I didn't know. But I wasn't about to check, not yet. Instead, I reached down, gripping the paper in my lap like a lifeline. The new rules. Someone had left them for me, but who? Or worse, what? The sun is not your friend. The orange glow outside deepened. Dark shadows stretched across the road, bleeding into the pavement like ink. I didn't look up. Rule number 3. If the sun sets too quickly, do not look at it. I kept my gaze locked on the desk, on the buttons, on the blinking lights of the register. Not outside. Never outside. The pressure in the booth thickened, like something was pushing down on me. The air felt warmer, not comforting, but wrong. Like standing too close to a fire that wasn't really there. Then, a whisper. Look. I clenched my jaw. Number I wouldn't. Another whisper. You have to see it. The voice was different now, deeper, twisting into something inhuman. The air grew heavier, my skin prickled with heat. I squeezed my eyes shut, gripping the edges of my chair so tightly my knuckles ached. A low hum filled the booth. Not mechanical, not natural. Like the air itself was vibrating. I pressed my hands over my ears, refused to listen, refused to look. And then, darkness, total, absolute. The sound stopped, the heat vanished. I slowly opened my eyes. The booth was silent. Outside, the sun was gone. The sky was black. No stars, no moon, just emptiness. And standing in the middle of the road, a figure, still, watching. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the figure took a step forward. The last rule. I glanced down at the paper one more time. At the bottom, in handwriting even more frantic than the rest, a final warning was scrawled in deep, jagged letters. If it reaches the booth before dawn, you won't get to leave this time. My breath caught in my throat. The figure took another step, slow, deliberate. A shape in the darkness, coming closer. Closer. The booth was supposed to be safe. But something told me, not tonight. Not anymore. I clenched my fists, eyes locked on the approaching figure. Dawn was still hours away, and I had no idea how to stop it. The figure on the road took another step, then another, and another, each movement slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the approach. The darkness swallowed everything around it. No stars, no moon, no headlights from distant cars, just me, the booth, and it. My breath came fast and shallow. I gripped the paper in my lap, the one with the new rules. If it reaches the booth before dawn, you won't get to leave this time. I glanced at the clock, 2:13 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. I was trapped, and the thing outside was getting closer. I forced myself to move, checked the locks, the windows, the back door. Everything was sealed. But somehow I knew that wouldn't be enough, not this time. The thing in the glass. A soft tap on the window made me flinch. My head snapped toward the sound. At first I saw nothing, just my reflection in the glass, wide-eyed, breathing hard. But then, it blinked. My reflection. It blinked, and I hadn't. I jerked back. The reflection grinned, mouth stretching too wide, teeth too sharp, eyes too dark. I squeezed my eyes shut. Number no, no, no. Evan, it whispered, my name, from my own mouth. Only it wasn't mine. I refused to open my eyes, because if I did, If I looked again, I knew I wouldn't be alone in the booth anymore. Knock, knock. A slow, deliberate tap against the glass. Let me in. I clenched my fists, didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the knocking stopped. I risked a glance. The window was empty. The reflection was gone. But outside, the figure was closer, standing right at the edge of the pavement now, watching, waiting. I had to do something. Breaking the rules, I grabbed the radio, fumbled with the frequency dial. Hello, anyone there? I stammered, static. Then a click, a voice, faint, distorted. Evan, I nearly dropped the radio because I knew that voice, my own. You're not real, I whispered. Silence. Then, laughter, a deep guttural sound that didn't belong to anything human. The lights in the booth flickered. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with something unnatural. The figure outside took another step. I was running out of time. The rules had kept me alive this long. But now, I had the sickening feeling that following them wasn't enough anymore. I had to do something different, something dangerous. I had to break the rules. The last toll, I reached beneath the counter, fingers fumbling for the emergency box, my last resort. Inside, a flare gun, a single shot, meant for mountain rescues. But maybe, just maybe, it could work on this. My hands shook as I loaded the cartridge, raised the gun, aimed at the figure outside. It didn't move, didn't flinch, just watched, waiting. I took a deep breath and pulled the trigger, a deafening bang. The flare shot through the darkness, and for the first time I saw it. The thing. Its face wasn't a face, just a black void, a hole in the world where something should have been. Its limbs stretched too long. Its body flickered like it wasn't fully here. The flare hit it, and the thing let out a screech, the sound of metal tearing, of something ancient and wrong. It staggered back. The shadows around it rippled, bending, writhing, and then it vanished. Gone, like it had never been there at all. The darkness lifted, the air grew light again, and slowly the sun began to rise. A new shift begins. I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, hands shaking. The new rules lay on the counter beside me, crumpled in my grip. I didn't know who had written them, didn't know why they had changed. But one thing was clear, something had been trying to get me. And this time, I had won. For now. A pair of headlights cut through the morning fog. A car, the first I had seen all night. A white sedan pulled up to the booth. The driver, an older man, rolled down his window, giving me a puzzled look. "You all right, son?" he asked. I stared at him, at the normalcy of it all. The toll booth, the road. I reached for the register, took his payment with steady hands, and as he drove away, I turned back to my booth. The shift was over, but something told me the rules would change again, and next time, I might not be so lucky.